Welcome to the Everyday Board Game Podcast with Daniel.
And Daniel, and special guest.
Jim.
We are joined by our friend Jim. He is a mutual friend of ours, and he plays some games with us. But we brought him in mainly because he is definitely our kind of go-to expert for video games. We are specifically with this topic of today's episode. We are talking about video games that we would like to see adapted into board games. So we wanted to bring in our special guest, Jim, to talk about those a little bit as well. And of course, as always, we put in a question onto the Facebook group. What I asked them is not only what games would they like to see adapted to video game, or I'm sorry, which video games they would like to see adapted into board games, what makes a good adaptation? Daniel, do you want to bring up the post for that?
We do have two answers to it. First is Katya. The important characters need to be in the game for sure, and Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger need good board game versions. I don't disagree there. I like both of those games, and I've heard some mixed reviews when it comes to them as board games.
Yeah, I do own a couple of the decks from Final Fantasy, the collectible card game, and it's no different than most collectible card games. It has the characters, it has chocobos, it has Cloud, it has, a lot of the main staples, but it's not really, I don't feel like I'm playing Final Fantasy by playing this game.
Alright, and our other comment is from Dustin Hahn. It needs to have the original feel of the game, not just the theme. For instance, if they made a Halo board game, it would have to feel like games in terms of using different strategies for different enemies, using cover effectively, stuff like that. But it also needs to have out-of-game things too, like if you have a game that has plenty of menu management, such as Skyrim, that needs to be included too. It also needs to be as fluid in the board game as it is in the video game. I don't want to be tracking 1,000 different things in a board game that a video game does for me. So it needs to be often be more streamlined than the original game itself. And of course, scale. If the original is a large open world, the board game needs to feel the same way. It's a tricky balance. As for which games, Halo as a mission-based skirmish dungeon crawl and Skyrim as an open-world adventure game for sure. Final Fantasy is a great option, especially if you based off something like 7. I'd also love to see a Zelda board game, and no, Tiny Epic Quest does not count. Full of dungeons and open-world puzzles, enemies to fight, and gear to collect, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think he brings up a very good point. Jim, I saw you nodding your head. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, the big one big thing that is different between board games and video games is that board games have the set of rules anywhere from as few as 1 to maybe like 20 pages of rules, but it's not nearly at the level of complexity a video game has to handle, but still have that like user experience. So no, I agree with that 100%.
Cool. Yeah, this brings me back to remembering Rado, who does Rado Runs Through. He was a video game developer before he started doing board game reviews, and he brings up a lot of the facts that video games have an advantage that all of their mechanisms and their systems and their user face is all hidden. Everything can run seamlessly, where if I'm just trying to go from point A to point B, I push the controller up. Whereas in a board game, you have to have cards or dice rolling or movements that however you need to move from point A to point B, it's not the same thing as just integrated into the system. And so video games have that big advantage. This list was kind of tricky for me, I'll be honest. So I don't play as many video games as you two, but what I ended up doing with my list, and we'll get into it specifically here in a bit, is I went with some of like my old classic like favorite games, but I strayed away from stuff like Final Fantasy because I don't think a board game adaptation could get to the point where I'd rather play that over a video game. So, like for example, Super Mario RPG, I just recently played that. I don't think that that you could reasonably make a board game out of it and get anything close to the same feel. Maybe like one of the mini games in it, like going on the barrels down the river, maybe, or the mine cart. But that's just kind of my thoughts when going into this. So you'll probably see that in my games that I picked, that they're probably more likely the simpler out of all the choices. How did you approach the
So,
list, Daniel?
For me, it was more along the lines. I get what people are saying. You want that implementation. You want that video game feel in a board game. And I understand that to an extent, but to me, the way I did it is that I want a good implementation as a board game. I want to have that board game feel in the world of said video game. I mean, you look at, I haven't played it, but I've heard really good things about it. The Minecraft Builders and
Oh yeah.
Biomes. I heard that's a really good implementation of a board game with a Minecraft theme upon it. And so fans of Minecraft would actually enjoy playing that kind of game. And so that's what I went through here is like, what kind of game do I want to play and how would it be integrated into that board game format?
Cool. And Jim, what were your thoughts when going into this list?
I mean, just in general, there's certain game types that are not conducive to, or harder to make like a game like platformers, for example. So, like, or in the Blind Forest, you could probably do something clever with that, but capturing that platformer element would be probably really difficult because it's reaction and things like that. Story-driven games are like your example of Final Fantasy or any RPG that has like its primary goal is to tell a story. Sure, you're fighting things like that. That I think it has a more difficult time translating into a board game and becoming. It leads more into like a D&D type thing. I think at that point.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, playing it out as an RPG. Let's start this conversation. Before we get into our top 3 and honorable mentions, what are some video game adaptations of board games that you've seen? You brought up the Minecraft Builders and Biomes. I've played that. I own it. It's pretty good. Having seen my son play Minecraft, not playing it myself, I don't think it's it's an adaptation. It's a good game with a good theme on it, but I don't think it's representative of the video game itself. Same with like Fallout. I've played the board game of Fallout as well. It's a great adventure game. You flip over tiles, you're playing it through, you're discovering different things as you unlock different quests. It goes to the next level where you get even more quests, etc., etc. And and depending on what choices you make, it unlocks certain other quests. But that also is very limited, and it's more upkeep than definitely the video game has. But it was a pretty good adaptation, in my opinion.
So for me, the way I'm looking at this is I'm not looking for a perfect implementation of video games. I look at something like Horrified. We've talked about it the last couple of weeks, and that's not a re-implementation of the movies. You have the movie lore in the game, but it's not necessarily you rehashing the movies. And that's how I feel about video games into board games, is that I don't, if I want the story of, as you mentioned earlier, Super Mario RPG, I'll play Super Mario RPG. I'll just go and bust out my SNES Classic and play it. However, if they could give me the implementation of a good quality board game where I can do some, even if it's just the mini games in Super Mario RPG, I'm enjoying it. It's a good adaptation of a board game, video game to a board game, and I'm fine with it. And I know what you were saying about the Minecraft biomes and whatever.
Yeah, buildings and biomes.
And so that's how I'm looking at it, is that how do they make this amazing IP and turn it into a board game format that makes sense? And so for me, that's where I'm coming from. Like, just right above your head, Horrified.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, and Jim, have you ever played any board games that are based off of video games that were any good?
The Portal board game was interesting. For me, like, so Portal, of course, it's got that main mechanic where you teleport from one to another, and they have that in the game. What was fun about the game is that it still captured the essence, the feel of the game. Like, there's this malevolent force at work, and the whole everything shifting and being destroyed kind of deal, and then fun with cake. But a lot of that tongue-in-cheek humor and there's a lot of really wacky stuff happening. I like that adaptation. That was interesting because it was different.
And that goes along the lines of what I was saying earlier. It's not a perfect adaptation of Portal. It's a board game system with the Portal theme on it, and it still gives you the Portal feel. And that I agree with Jim. It was actually a really fun game to play.
Very cool. Yeah, and then is this game above my head, City Skylines, that Jim and I have both played. I think he played the first game with me, and from what I
Yep.
understand, it's not a perfect adaptation of the game. Like I know, like the video game has a lot of like management of different. It has a lot of like management for like roads and just general metrics, where this is kind of like just, you're toggling switches effectively, but how to do that the most efficiently is where the game comes in, and that's the ultimate goal of the game. So that came out to be a pretty good positive example of that. On the other side, though, we could talk about like negative examples. Like the two that immediately come to mind for me is Super Mario, the power up card game, which is you're simulating different,
Or Oregon Trail. Oh my god.
or Oregon Trail. Yeah, I mean it's just completely random. I mean technically there's quite a bit of random in the video game, but like the card game, why even play it if it's going to be even more random and less choice?
But the thing is with the Oregon Trail, the video game, for one, it's an older game, and two, it's you still make meaningful choices in that game. Do I go out to hunt? Do I cross this river? This one, it's just a flip of a card. If something bad happens, when we played it, I died within the second flip. I got dysentery, and that was it.
Yep, game over.
I didn't
Yeah.
even make it past St. Louis.
Right. No, I thought the same with like the Sonic board games. I've only played one of them, but I heard the new one is fairly similar to the idea. Sonic, you want the game to be fast, and even if you don't like play live action, really fast moves, you still like in the video game, you're still or in the board game, you're still like taking 2 to 3 minutes per your turn to try and figure out where is going to be the best way for me to move. That's not Sonic. You
And
don't have that
there's
feel.
another one that I had issue with. I didn't even play it. I watched it played, and I was like, no, this is not. And that's the Mega Man board game.
Oh yeah, no, that was frustrating because in Mega Man, here was my main argument with the Mega Man board game, and you played part of it. Um, Technically, you took over for me when I had to leave when we were first playing it, and the game itself wasn't difficult, but you're rolling dice to complete challenges. The problem with that is in a video game, you get better. You memorize the moves, you jump around better, you're able to control yourself better, and you're able to get the power ups. Where in Mega Man the board game, you can't be better at rolling dice. You just re-roll sometimes, but then that's it. You don't have that inherent skill increase. So yeah, that was a frustrating experience.
Jim, do you have any board games?
Uh, oh, did I dislike?
Yeah, that were video game implementations.
Let's see. Not off the top of my head, but I mean, I am seeing the kind of a common theme, platformers and like action-based. And I imagine a first-person shooter would be kind of difficult. Like, I mean, I remember I actually liked Frag, though. I mean, that's kind
Frag,
of
yeah,
first-person. It wasn't a direct one, but I mean, it's video game inspired. So
yeah,
that was actually good, but it's not the same as you know you moving your mouse around, crazy, nothing like that. But
yeah.
as far as yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I don't play. I play a lot of board games, but I'm less familiar with them. So
Yeah.
sorry.
Well, you bring up a good point with Frag though. So that goes into my honorable mentions one. It's like what there are some board games that actually adapt from video games that obviously didn't have the license. So like if Halo was a board game, it would have been Frag. You know, like that system is awesome. But then you have stuff like Halo Risk. And then it just doesn't make sense with how the mechanisms work. Frag makes way more sense by Steve Jackson games.
Or
So,
Adrenaline. That's another good first-person
oh
shooter
yeah.
type board game that implements first-person shooters actually really well.
Yep. Yeah, so there's a lot of ways they could have done it, but chose not to. So, do we have any other thoughts that we want to get into before we go into our top three?
I'm good on that front. I'm ready to go into my honorable mentions before I go into my top
Oh,
three.
of course, yeah, yeah. Jim, any other thoughts before we jump in?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and start with my honorable mention, and it'll make a lot of sense why. Um, there is a video game for the Dreamcast that I used to play the absolute mess out of. It was a puzzle game where you had a bunch of mice around the board. They would move automatically, like in a straight line. When they hit a wall, they would turn to the right, and you had to lay down arrows for them to change paths, or cats to make them go in opposite directions, or all of these other different puzzle elements, basically to get the mice to the rocket ship and fly away. It was called Choo Choo Rocket. It was an absolutely amazing puzzle game. It was really solid, um, and from what it seems like, and this is why it's an honorable mention, is because there's a game from Command Games called Quirky Circuits that plays over a series of levels, and they are this puzzle where you have to get like the mouse, or you have to like vacuum up dust bunnies in a certain way, and they'll tell you once they hit a wall they turn in a certain direction, and each robot works differently, and as a group you have to play programming cards to help them, or help the gizmo or the robot to accomplish the goal. So it's pretty much an adaptation of the video game. That was one of my first ones because I loved playing Choo Choo Rocket. It was such a fun puzzle game, but it's pretty much adapted into a board game now, which is why I wanted to. That's an honorable mention.
Jim, do you have your first honorable mention?
There, I would say, so there's this game on the Sega Genesis, it shows my age, called Haunting. And I don't know if any of you have played Haunting or not, but you're basically like
this, familiar with it. This was a long time ago.
Yeah, you're like this cool Frank. I think his name was Frankie. You're like a Frankenstein poltergeist, or polterguy. That was his name. And so, so the premise of the story is that this family moved into into a house, like a big mansion, and your job is to scare them and get them out of the house. And so you would walk from room to room, and then if they were there in the room, then you could like choose an item like a blender or something like that, and do some cheesy like horror movies. You could make like the blender start spinning up and fill with blood, and then like, oh no, and then they fall over and faint, and then you get like some points which you use later on. I think that'd be a really fun game, just because it's it's moving around. I figure you could probably adapt it into like a multiplayer game where you're all trying to scare them somehow or another. So I think that'd be neat.
That would be.
So my first honorable mention myself, and Jim's actually familiar with this game, and that's RimWorld. I think this would be just a really good implementation because you could be multiplayer. You can each have your own faction. You're building up your defenses in your colony, but you can go a la the way warring colonies go in Dead of Winter, where you actually can start raiding each other, or you're just trying to escape the planet. You can play peaceful, or you can start attacking and become pirates and stuff like that. And I think it would just be a good implementation because just the scope of what you could do with RimWorld, because you can start the game with nothing or very little, and then you have to build up. You have to get your resources, and you got to build up your character, your town, your village. Try to recruit more people. Then you can start raiding and capturing other people. And so I think this would be an interesting board game adaptation just to see how it would work in a multiplayer setting.
That's cool. Yeah, that's a good choice. My second one also pretty much has a board game that is an adaptation of it. And it's called... I want to see Mario Kart as a board game. And Russian Bash by Quick Simple Funds is right now the closest variation of it. Because it's very simple. You have items, you're just moving forward a number of spaces, and your cards have dual uses. First you move a number of spaces, then you do an action. So you might either turn or move over to another lane, or launch like a brick at somebody, or different items that have these cool abilities. And the idea is that you're just trying to get first to the finish line. Very simple version of it. But if I saw that move to Mario Kart, I think that would be a phenomenal game. Because it really does bring out the, driving around, fast-paced, blowing each other up with weapons. It's awesome. That was my second honorable mention.
Jim?
So I would say, just because I like weird games, Untitled Goose Game, I think, would probably be... Because who doesn't want to be a mischievous goose running around causing trouble? Yeah, I'm not too familiar, but there's like a bunch of stealth games out there for sure, but Goose is an unconventional one. But just the idea of I'm not sure how you would implement it, but I'm sure that there's a clever way to come up with
I think actually that one would make a pretty good solo game where you're trying to figure out the puzzle of how to annoy everybody in the neighborhood.
Yeah, because for those of you who are uninitiated to the game, you're a not so nice goose, and you walk around. So humans, like for example, the one of the first ones, there's a gentleman. He's minding his own business. He's farming. He's or not farming, gardening. So he's tending to his garden, and gives you tasks to do. So you have to get into the garden, whichever. But a lot of it involves you causing mischief. One might be to steal his keys and drop it in the lake, stuff like that.
So this is why I call geese Satanbergs.
Satanbergs. That's so bad. All right, Daniel, what's your second? That's a good pick, Jim. I don't know how they would adapt it to a board game, but you can.
I'm telling you, you could do it kind of all on Irem in like a solo play where you're trying to figure out the puzzle through a deck of cards and stuff like that.
See, I was actually thinking about like moving a 3D goose on like a hex grid, like moving around, like kind of like a pick up and deliver game. But then there's all sorts.
It's a big distraction thing. So you do something, and then if he's like within a certain radius, he's like, "Oh, what's this?" And he goes over here, so you gotta like go around him, and this maybe something like that.
That'd be cool, like a little area of where they can see. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
And so for my pick for honorable mention here. There's already a game that's implemented on this. I think it's a card game, if I remember correctly. And everything I've heard about it, it is not good. And that's the Witcher series. I think if you implement, I don't know how they would do it, and that's why it's only an honorable mention, is if you implement a Witcher board game and it gives you the monster hunting aspect as well as the political drama that the Witchers tend to have, the video games themselves, I think it would, I don't know how they would do it, if they did it in a campaign style, but just give me that feel that I get when I play like Witcher or Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt, which is the one I'm actually referencing here. And I think it just needs a better board game, per se.
Yeah, I have played the Witcher board game before, and yeah, not knowing anything about the series, it was okay at best. It didn't seem all that interesting to me anyway. Whereas like the Fallout board game, that was really fun to play, and I still didn't know anything about the storyline.
Yeah, but the way they implemented it. The Fallout board game, I want to pick it up. I'm a huge Fallout fan. I've played. I was telling you my Steam list. I have Fallout 1, 2, and Tactics on Steam. I own 3, New Vegas, and Fallout 4 on the PlayStation. So.
Yep. Fallout is a good one. I heard Fallout Shelter is pretty good too. So
yeah, I want to play. Yeah. I do enjoy playing the video game Fallout Shelter. It's just a colony-based game where you're just trying to keep everything going and you have raids and stuff like that.
Cool.
But I heard the actual card game is pretty good too, and it comes in a little lunch pail, so that interests me.
Yeah, that's pretty great. All right, do we have any others that we want to mention before we go on?
I can't think of any off the top of my head, Jim.
No.
Okay. Oh, one that I do want to bring up just as a quick second, Shadowgate. I like point-and-click games, like from old school point-and-click, but Cosmos' adventure games, Jim knows what I'm talking about, the dungeon one, it's faithful to that style. It's solid. It's not...
That's actually one of the reasons why I picked like a game like Myst or something like that, because I heard there's a really good implementation with like Dungeon or with the Cosmo Adventure games.
Yep, exactly. So, with that being said, let's get into our top 3. Who would like to take the lead on this?
I'll go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
So my first pick is Machinarium. It's a game by Amanita Design. It's a point-and-click game. I figured I'd just get that out of the way. No, it's really neat though. It's clever. It's a game about a little robot that is trying to save his girlfriend in his town, but there's nothing being said. It's a very, very visual game. Everything is hand drawn. I think it would be a really neat board game for that. Because point and click is it's if done right, it can be really really good stuff like the adventure game you're playing for.
Cool. Yeah, point and click I think is right for now that legacy games and all that are coming out. Yeah, ooh, good storytelling ones.
Yeah, and then I mean, they got board games based off the Choose Your Own Adventure books. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I can't see why point and click games can't be a thing.
Right, exactly. All right, I'll go next. My pick is kind of a cheat. It is an app game, and it's an app card game called Card Crawl, where you are this character. You have a certain number of life. You can hold one thing in your left hand, one thing in your right, and you're gathering weapons to beat monsters. I mean, it really is a card game that they only made for an app. They haven't actually made it as a card game, and I feel like it would be really a phenomenal game to play, and I would gladly buy sets for it to play over and over. And new cards give you new abilities, but mainly you're just trying to survive. It's a one-player solitaire card game. Phenomenal little game. I mean, maybe they might even made an analog version of it, and if so, I want to know about it so I can buy it because it's really fun. And that's Card Crawl, kind of my cheat game.
Well, for once, I don't have the cheats on my list here.
Yeah, mine are that's the only one. The other two legitimately they're fair. But that is my cheat game.
Well, my number one kind of is a cheat, but you'll see why. So my number three game that I picked here is Infamous. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the video game Infamous, but the reason why I went with this one is because the way you can do it, especially for like a multiplayer purposes, you can make it a co-op where you're a group of people who get superpowers. And the way you can make it is a campaign style that has a branching campaign, because in the Infamous game itself, there's a reason why it's called Infamous. You could either become infamous or famous, basically go down the anti-hero and hero timelines, and so you can choose which way you want to go. And so I think it would be interesting that you can even do it where you're playing a multiplayer and it's a co-op, and you guys decide, one of you decides to break away and go down, or a couple of you decide to go break away into the infamous side, while the other one's like, no, I still want to be good, and they go the other way, and then it turns into like a battle skirmish, like who can meet their goals first, who's better at it. And I think that would be an interesting implementation of a video game.
Very cool. Yeah, it sounds like a game I'd play. That's pretty fun. It almost reminds me of, like, just by the title alone, Nefarious, the card game. Like, I mean, it's that. Anyway, I'm sure it's a completely different game, but it sounds like it would be on point. All right, number twos.
Jim?
Okay, my number two choice is a game called it's Monaco. What's yours is mine. It's an interesting game. So the premise is that you are a group of thieves and you're trying to break in to various things. So the story progresses where, like, I believe you're first trying to break out of prison. What's neat about it is that each of the characters that you have different abilities. So, like, there's the cleaner. He gets to sneak up behind and dispatch an enemy. There's the gentleman. He doesn't have a disguise all the time. What he does, he looks quite fantastic at it. So with the game, the way it works is that when you're walking around, there are patrol mobs, and if they see you, then they get alerted. Everyone gets alerted, and they come to you. So it's not a confrontation game. Primarily, it's sneak around and hide kind of deal. So if they see you, then they'll probably shoot at you, and you die very quickly. But each of the different abilities, like the mole, he can break through walls. The redhead, she can manipulate people, so she can charm enemies. If they die, then you can use all them. So your each playthrough or game rather, you get a game over if they all die. If there's no one else you can pick. But I think it'd be really neat because it's a top-down kind of deal, and so you can sneak around while they're trying to get you. So that's my number two.
Yeah, I
That's
feel
pretty
like
cool.
that sounds like it would be a perfect, like, adaptation to a board game. Yeah, I can see it now. I would totally play that. That's awesome. My number two is another old school puzzle game, where you have a bunch of characters that you're just trying to get from point A to the door, point B, and that is lemmings. And each of the lemmings you actually send to like either build stairs or block the other lemmings, and they're all just following the same path. I don't know how you would implement that as a board game. Um, I mean, I could think of some like like meeples all walking in a straight line, and it's a puzzle game. And I don't know how it would be a multiplayer game either, but I would love to get the same feel of Lemmings in a board game, where you whereas some of them are just like falling off cliffs, and you're just like, oh god, just stop dying, please. I gotta bring you over here. Yeah, it's a fun little puzzle game, and yeah, puzzle games seem like they would adapt over pretty well, but that's your timing is how many lemmings go as well, and so while you're blocking some, you might be killing others.
Yeah, no, I get. Yeah, I haven't played Lemmings in such a long time, and I find it interesting though that the way we're going about this is Jim's talking about all the like the independent games that I've never even heard of, but sound really cool. You're over here talking about like all the old school games, and I'm like mass market games over here. This is me right here.
Oh, just wait, I go older.
The AAA games. What are you gonna do? Like Asteroid or something?
It's not far from it. But well, I mean, like if we talked about classic arcade games, I mean, there's they made which one did I just play recently? Missile Command, and I have